Welcome back to my YouTube channel today, and here is the content of today's video. The ultimatum delivered by former President Donald Trump to Nicolás Maduro, leave the country or face consequences, is not merely a moment of diplomatic brinkmanship. It is a symbol of something much larger. The reawakening of hemispheric geopolitics, the reassertion of American coercive power in the Western Hemisphere, and the unraveling of old assumptions about who controls the political destiny of Latin America. Venezuela, once just another troubled petrostate, has become the stage upon which the world's great powers test their leverage in a multipolar age. To understand the weight of Trump's threats, one must appreciate the historical shadow they inhabit. For more than a century, the United States viewed Latin America through the lens of the Monroe Doctrine, a sphere where no external power could challenge Washington's primacy. But that doctrine, once unshakable, has been eroded by decades of globalization, Chinese lending, Russian security cooperation, and the slow but irreversible diversification of global influence. Today, Venezuela is not an isolated outlier. It is a geopolitical hinge connecting energy routes, ideological loyalties, and foreign patronage networks. Trump's reported warning, paired with threats to blow up vessels connected to the Venezuelan state, is therefore more than a policy choice. It is the reemergence of gunboat geopolitics, where naval power becomes a tool of political enforcement. It signals that Washington is willing to wield hard power against a government it sees as both illegitimate and strategically dangerous. Yet even as the rhetoric intensifies, key officials within the U.S. administration acknowledge that there is no appetite for a deep military entanglement. This internal contradiction, hawks demanding action, realists warning of overstretch, reveals a deeper uncertainty inside the American strategic establishment. Maduro's survival is not simply the durability of an authoritarian regime. It is the result of structural backing from powers who reject Washington's claim to hemispheric leadership. Russia provides military advisors, oil partnerships, and political cover at the United Nations. China supplies loans, infrastructure, investment, and a long-term economic presence built through decades of bilateral cooperation. In this context, Trump's ultimatum is not directed solely at Maduro. It is directed at Moscow and Beijing. It is a test. Will they defend their strategic investment in the Western Hemisphere, or will they concede the ground to Washington? Venezuela thus becomes an arena not of internal collapse, but of external competition. Each actor sees something different in it. The United States sees a security risk near its maritime routes. Russia sees a foothold in America's backyard, symbolically invaluable. China sees an energy partner and a test case for resisting unilateral pressure. The ultimatum to Maduro reverberates across all these layers. What we are witnessing is not merely a diplomatic showdown, but the opening act of a larger question. In a multipolar world, does the United States still possess uncontested authority in its own hemisphere? The answer will shape not only the fate of Caracas, but the very architecture of global power in the decades ahead. For Russia and China, Venezuela is far more than a distant partner or an economic investment. It is a strategic beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, a rare point of leverage in what has historically been a U.S.-dominated geopolitical space. Losing Maduro's government would not simply mean the collapse of an allied regime. It would signify the erosion of a multipolar world order in which Moscow and Beijing have painstakingly asserted their presence. The stakes are therefore immense. For Moscow, Venezuela holds symbolic and strategic value. Venezuela is therefore not merely a battlefield of ideology or oil. It is the front line of a global contest over whose power defines the future of international order. Nicaragua. Would Washington feel emboldened to challenge Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific with greater force? Would Russia see an expanded U.S. footprint even closer to its strategic maritime routes? Thus, Trump's ultimatum to Maduro reverberates into a deeper question: who sets the rules of engagement in the 21st century? Is the Western Hemisphere still a U.S. enclave, or is it now a contested political landscape where great powers maintain genuine footholds? Both Moscow and Beijing understand that yielding Venezuela without resistance would be tantamount to conceding that America still commands an exclusive sphere of influence. In a multipolar world, such concessions are rare. More importantly, Venezuela represents a test case for China's ability to shield its partners from American coercion. If Beijing allows Maduro to be overthrown without response, it sends a dangerous signal to other nations within its orbit, whether in Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East, that Chinese backing may not be enough to withstand Washington. Such an image would weaken China's credibility as a global counterweight. This is why Russia and China cannot simply walk away. Their calculations extend beyond bilateral ties. They are thinking about precedent. In geopolitics, the fall of one partner often invites pressure on the next. If Venezuela collapses, would Cuba be next? China's stakes are even more layered. Over nearly 2 decades, Beijing has poured billions of dollars into Venezuela through loans for oil arrangements, energy projects, telecommunications, infrastructure, and mining ventures. These investments are part of China's broader ambition to secure diversified, long-term energy supplies and build networks of economic dependence across the global South. Should Washington succeed in reshaping Venezuelan governance, these assets may be jeopardized or renegotiated under American pressure, undermining Chinese influence at a time when Beijing is positioning itself as the champion of a post-Western global order. At a time when Russia faces intense sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military strain, maintaining influence in the Americas demonstrates that its reach has not been confined to the margins of Europe or Central Asia. Moscow's presence in Caracas through arms sales, energy partnerships, and military advisors serves as a defiant reminder that Russia can still shape outcomes in America's traditional sphere of influence. If Maduro falls under U.S. pressure, Russia risks losing not only strategic assets, but also the perception of resilience that it has sought to cultivate amid the Ukraine conflict. For President Putin, perception is not a secondary detail. It is the essence of deterrence. If Washington tries to topple Maduro or cut off Venezuela's vital sea lanes, Moscow and Beijing are unlikely to sit idly by. Their tools will not be the same as U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups or missile strikes, but they are no less important. For Russia, the first tool is diplomatic escalation. Moscow has long mastered the art of using international forums, most notably the UN Security Council, to obstruct, delay, and delegitimize U.S. moves. Any U.S. attempt to sanction, isolate, or intervene in Venezuela would be met with a Russian veto, but Russia's influence goes beyond procedural diplomacy. Through its network of ties with Cuba, Nicaragua, and several Caribbean governments, Moscow could mobilize a resistance bloc, transforming Venezuela from a national crisis into a regional fault line. The second tool is security assistance below the threshold of war. Russia has deployed military advisors, technicians, and private contractors to Venezuela. If U.S. pressure increases, Moscow could bolster Caracas with electronic warfare units, upgrade air defenses, share intelligence, and maritime surveillance assets. These deployments would not deter U.S. intervention outright, but they would change the cost calculus, force Washington to reconsider the political risks of employing Russian-linked personnel. By contrast, China operates on economic leverage. Caracas owes Beijing tens of billions of dollars in long-term loans backed by oil. If the Maduro regime is threatened, China could freeze debt renegotiations, cut energy deals that stabilize Venezuela's revenues, or increase cooperation with PDVSA to maintain critical infrastructure. Equally significant, China could retaliate against U.S. pressure by restricting access to rare earths, disrupting supply chains, or altering energy flows, tools that Washington is increasingly concerned about. But Beijing also possesses a quiet but powerful form of influence: information infrastructure. Chinese telecom companies are deeply embedded in Venezuela's digital backbone. In times of crisis, control of data networks can shape the domestic narrative, strengthening the regime's ability to manage dissent, stabilize communications, and counter U.S.-backed media campaigns. Both Russia and China could also deploy the most subtle tool: symbolic escalation. This could take the form of naval port visits near Venezuelan waters, joint exercises in the Caribbean, or increased diplomatic coordination with anti-U.S. governments in Latin America. None of these moves cross the threshold of war, but each sends a clear message that Washington no longer dictates the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere. The underlying logic is simple. If the United States can exert pressure globally, so can its adversaries. By defending Venezuela, not necessarily for Maduro's benefit, but for their own, they demonstrate that multipolarity is no longer a theory, but a living geopolitical reality. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a proxy not for ideology, but for the international hierarchy. Russia and China understand that Maduro's fall under U.S. pressure would set a precedent. Washington, even in the 21st century, still decides which governments exist in its hemisphere. To allow that precedent is to cede a structural advantage. And in great power politics, structural concessions have repercussions far beyond the current battlefield. The possibility of a U.S.-driven regime change in Venezuela reverberates far beyond Caracas. It unsettles Washington, divides Europe, and sends tremors throughout Latin America, where memories of intervention and its unintended consequences remain vivid. Trump's ultimatum to Maduro does not exist in a vacuum. It interacts with a world already strained by competing power blocks, economic fragility, and the unraveling of long-standing diplomatic norms. The reactions it provokes are therefore complex, layered, and often contradictory. For the United States, Venezuela presents both opportunity and danger. On one hand, toppling Maduro would allow Washington to reclaim strategic dominance in its own hemisphere, an assertion that the Monroe Doctrine, though softened by rhetoric, still holds weight. It would weaken Russia's symbolic foothold and disrupt Beijing's long-term energy investments. Yet Washington is acutely aware of the risks. a direct confrontation could entangle the U.S. in another prolonged conflict, especially if Russia or China respond with calibrated asymmetric pressure. Domestic fatigue with foreign entanglements remains high, and the political costs of a miscalculated intervention could be immense. The U.S. finds itself torn between projecting power and avoiding overextension, between the impulse to act and the strategic necessity of restraint. Europe, meanwhile, faces a different dilemma. The European Union nominally supports democratic transitions in Venezuela, yet it cannot ignore the geopolitical context. Europe is still absorbing the economic fallout of the war in Ukraine. Energy dependence has shaken its internal cohesion. For Brussels fears any clash between Washington and Moscow could widen into a global confrontation. For European policymakers, Venezuela is not simply a political crisis, it is a potential spark for another rupture in East-West stability. The EU wants influence, but it does not want escalation. In a cruel paradox, the more aggressively Washington moves, the more Europe risks being sidelined, reduced to a spectator in a conflict that affects its energy markets and diplomatic credibility. Across Latin America, reactions oscillate between defiance and apprehension. Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia recognize that a U.S. intervention, even a limited one, could destabilize the entire region. Latin America's governments fear a cascade of refugees, economic shocks, and renewed polarization. They also fear becoming pawns in a global contest between superpowers. Nations like Cuba and Nicaragua would likely rally around Maduro, not because they endorse his governance, but because they oppose the precedent of Washington enforcing political outcomes by force. Others, especially in the Caribbean, dread the possibility that Venezuela could become another proxy battlefield, attracting foreign militarization. Yet the most subtle and perhaps most dangerous fear lies in market psychology. U.S.-Russia-China showdown in Venezuela would send shockwaves through energy markets. Oil prices could spike. Shipping routes in the Caribbean could be disrupted. The global South, already fragile from inflation and food insecurity, would bear the brunt. Investors sensing geopolitical instability could withdraw capital from emerging markets. In short, Venezuela's crisis would not remain regional. It would metastasize into a global economic tremor. Thus, Trump's ultimatum triggers a chain of anxieties. Washington fears strategic paralysis. Europe fears marginalization. Latin America fears destabilization. Global markets fear volatility. And overarching all these fears is a deeper question, whether the world is drifting into an age where local crises automatically become global confrontations, where the fall of a single government can set off tremors that shake the balance of power from Washington to Beijing to Brussels. The confrontation over Venezuela is not, in essence, a dispute about Nicolás Maduro or the internal governance of a single Latin American state. It is a window into the deeper mechanics of a world sliding towards structural fragility, where great powers clash indirectly over symbols, footholds, and spheres of influence. Venezuela stands at the fault line of this emerging order, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. At its core, the crisis reveals a profound truth about international politics in the 21st century. The age of uncontested hegemony is over, replaced by an era of competitive multipolarity. The United States no longer exercises the unilateral authority it once wielded in the Western Hemisphere. Russia and China, despite their own weaknesses and contradictions, have carved out spaces of influence that challenge old assumptions. Venezuela is one such space, a test of whether the U.S. can still impose political outcomes beyond its borders, or whether rival powers can shield partners from external pressure. In this context, Maduro's survival becomes symbolic. If he withstands American demands with support from Moscow and Beijing, it signals that the U.S. Must now contend with counterweights even in its traditional spheres. If he falls, it suggests the Western Hemisphere remains a zone where the U.S. retains structural dominance. For global observers, from African capitals to Middle Eastern monarchies, from Southeast Asian democracies to Eastern European states, the outcome is instructive. Who protects whom? Who can withstand pressure? Whose alliance guarantees resilience? What makes the Venezuelan case especially revealing is the way it exposes the fragility of proxies in an age of multi-layered competition. Unlike Cold War client states, which were often locked into rigid ideological camps, modern partners navigate shifting loyalties, economic dependencies, and information ecosystems. Maduro leans on Russian security expertise, Chinese financial lifelines, and regional ideological solidarity. The U.S. counters with sanctions, intelligence capabilities, and diplomatic pressure. The result is a geopolitical tug-of-war fought not through armies, but through oil flows, port access, maritime routes, electronic networks, and perceptions of legitimacy. The fragility lies in the fact that proxies today are neither fully sovereign nor fully subordinate. They exist in a gray zone, empowered by external support, yet vulnerable to the very intervention that such support provokes. Venezuela illustrates the paradox. The more Russia and China invest in preserving Maduro, the more Washington views the country as a strategic challenge. But the crisis also reveals something deeper. Conflicts now travel, crossing continents with ease. A pressure point in Latin America triggers reactions in Brussels, energy anxieties in Berlin, strategic recalculations in Tokyo, and counter-messaging in Beijing. The world has lost the buffer zones that once localized tensions. The architecture of global interdependence, financial, technological, informational, ensures that every spark risks becoming a global signal. In this fragile, multipolar order, the greatest danger is not open war, but misjudgment. Each power believes it can act with precision, the U.S. with its ultimatums, China with its loans, Russia with its strategic symbolism, yet all underestimate the cascading effects of interventions in an interconnected world. Venezuela, therefore, is more than a geopolitical contest. It is a test of whether nations can navigate rivalry without allowing proxy crises to spiral into systemic instability. It is a reminder that the real question of our century is not who dominates, but whether the global order can sustain tension without collapsing under the weight of competitive ambition.